I was approached by a pastor recently who was looking at starting a Christian apologetics course for his church. And he said to me that he wanted to use the text Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig. Now, this text has been around in various iterations since the 1980s. I believe, as I recall, that it's based upon Craig's book Christian Apologetics from the 80s. In terms of the form Reasonable Faith, it's, as you can see here, it has at least 3 editions, and I have used it myself in apologetics classrooms for 15 years or so. So it is a very solid textbook. I did, however, advise him that I didn't think this was actually the best book to use in a Christian apologetics context for lay Christians. Not because it's highfalutin, that it's too technical, but I think that for the most part, Reasonable Faith is addressing the kinds of issues that are not obstacles for the average person, and that it doesn't address the kinds of issues that are obstacles for the average person. And that frankly, books like Reasonable Faith, they show what the Christian conservative Protestant apologetic culture, sort of subculture, is interested in, but less in terms of awareness as to what the wider issues in the broader culture are. So here's an example. Take a look at the table of contents for Reasonable Faith. So it begins off part 1, chapter 1. How do I know Christianity is true? So, your general abstract conversation about epistemology, theory of knowledge, the concept of faith, reason, uh, trust, rationality, things like that. Part 2 and chapter 2 deals with the question of the existential appeal of belief in God and allegedly the absurdity of life without God. And so those are sort of classic abstract philosophical questions that really have gripped people like Friedrich Nietzsche and people like Camus and Sartre and so on. You read the French existentialists and you think, okay, this is a major issue. And Craig himself, in his own testimony, he will talk about how he believed as a teenager that if there was no God, life is meaningless. So certainly those questions do resonate with some people. And then we have part 3, perhaps the longest section in the book, which is 2 chapters on arguments for God's existence. And then you move on to historical knowledge, miracles, and then the resurrection of Jesus. That's a nice standard package of conservative Christian apologetics. But as I said, I wouldn't recommend it because I think for the most part, it is dealing with questions that people are not, they're not at the forefront of conversation. So take a look at the issue on debating God's existence, for example. In my experience, people tend to come, and now there are people who are just seriously engaged in that question. And for the most part, they are involved in the Christian apologetic subculture. And so you have Christians and non-Christians, counter apologists, you can call them, or atheistic apologists, who are in their debates with one another in academic journals and also in a lay context online, in forums, on Reddit, on Twitter, on Facebook, or what have you. But for the most part, most people, and certainly people in the church, they're not overly concerned about arguments for God's existence. As I said, people tend to come in one of 2 groups. Either they sort of accept, yeah, there is a God, or I don't have any intrinsic objection to there being a God. I tend to think there's a higher power. There's something out there to connect with. There are those people. And then there are people that are like the new atheists, or people that are part of the flying spaghetti monster age, where they are just overtly caustic toward the idea of God. They don't argue against it. They just find it implausible, indeed silly. And so for these 2 different groups, arguments for God's existence, for the most part, miss the mark. Because the first group, this isn't at the height of their concern. They already are committed to some idea of God. And the second group, well, they're going to find, for the most part, that those arguments are equally implausible because they've already rejected as implausible the idea of God. So if you want to, it's like this, if you want to get your tire to get traction on the road and you have summer tires on, first of all, you have to melt the ice, right? And then you can get traction on the ground. But if you have summer tires on ice, you're just going to spin. And if you try to present arguments for God's existence to people who find the idea of God to be ridiculous, they equate it to a flying spaghetti monster or to Thor or to some other dead god or some absurd construct like an invisible pink unicorn, well, your arguments aren't going to have traction until you melt the ice of implausibility. So for the most part, I find that a large section on arguments for God's existence sort of isn't getting at the heart of where most people are at. To some extent, I think that's also the case when it comes to arguments for the resurrection of Jesus and some of these other questions. In my experience, most people are dealing with a range of other questions when it comes to the apologetic defense or the plausibility of Christianity. And I'd like to just end by briefly going through some of the questions that people do wrestle with today. So, for example, questions pertaining to science and faith. Yes, one of the classic questions that has really occupied people in the last century has been the relationship of Christianity to neo-Darwinism, to the idea of the common descent of biological organisms on Earth. And how do you reconcile Genesis to that story? I think that we made a lot of progress here in terms of opening up the alternatives away from a narrow fundamentalist young Earth creationism to not only considering old Earth creationism, but also a range of theistic evolutionary perspectives or evolutionary creationist perspectives. But even beyond that conversation, there are all sorts of other issues. One of them that I talked about in my book, Conversations with My Inner Atheist, is to address a very important question that if you read in the Bible, what you find is there's a common assumption that natural disasters are the result of the active divine willing of God bringing upon judgment on nations. So for example, if you have a volcano or you have a flood or you have an earthquake, well, or a pestilence or a drought, you attribute that to God's divine action. And there wasn't a sense of a discrete realm of nature such as we understand in the modern world. It's very different today in the modern world where we do think of a discrete realm of nature into which God intervenes, rather than having nature as a direct ongoing expression of the divine will, which is much closer to an ancient Hebrew and a biblical, quote unquote, perspective. So what we have to think in a broader sense is how do you bring those pictures together? How do you reconcile questions like that? Issues like not evolution, questions like relativity theory or how does the soul relate to the body in terms of could neuroscience make the idea of life after death implausible, or could it negate it by showing that consciousness is simply a product of the brain? These are just a few of the questions that people wrestle with on a daily basis when it comes to science and faith. Another area that's a really big area when it comes to apologetics, and is increasingly so in the last few years, is the relationship between sexual ethics and civil rights. So here we want to think about this coalition of interests that are, we can say, non-heteronormative. In other words, people who do not conform to the heteronormative standard of opposite sex attraction expressed through a monogamous relationship where your birth sex is the same as your gender expression. So that's sort of what, that has been the meta-narrative, the norm for a long time. And that hegemony of the heteronormative perspective is being challenged increasingly by people who have long been excluded by that perspective. So of course you have people who are same-sex attracted, you have gay, lesbian people, bisexual people. You also have transgender people who do not identify with their birth sex. You have intersex people who do not conform biologically or in terms of their genetics to a either being male or female. They're somewhere perhaps more on a continuum. All of these people have found themselves excluded from the traditional narrative. And so this has prompted a huge conversation. So that, for example, in the 1960s, the debate was this. One of the debates was this. Should it be legally permissible and socially acceptable for interracial people to marry? And there's a famous court case that went to the Supreme Court in the United States called Loving, based upon the surname of the litigants who brought this case forward. It's a movie about it was made a few years ago. So it was, as I recall, a Caucasian male and a Afro-American female who wanted to have the right to marry within their state, and they brought that to the Supreme Court. Today, nobody, I think, hopefully would say that's an issue. Of course, interracial people can marry and should be allowed to marry and should not face any social stigma when they do so. Well, now the conversation has shifted to things like same-sex relationships, same-sex marriage. And today, the Christian who takes the traditional prohibition stance, that of course not all Christians do, some are same-sex affirming, but those who take the traditional stance are viewed much as the people who were against interracial marriage in the 1960s. That creates a huge obstacle for conveying Christianity as a plausible, let alone true understanding of the world, if your presentation of Christianity is viewed as being on the wrong side of the civil rights issue. So definitely this is an issue that Christians have to continue to wrestle with and face squarely. A third one is the politicization of Christianity. And this has always been an issue, of course, throughout history. I mean, think back to Constantine in the 4th century, appropriating Christianity with the Roman Empire. But in our own day, in the last several decades, the book Jesus and John Wayne sort of tells the story going back to the 1940s. Christianity has been so, to say, evangelical conservative Christianity has become very aligned with a particular patriarchal perspective and a conservative perspective on the political spectrum. So that today, many people, when they think of Christianity, they think of the Republican Party and Donald Trump, which of course, for those of us who can see Donald Trump is a completely amoral, misogynist, narcissist, this is just something that makes you want to pull your hair out. How do you think about a more adequate engagement of politicizing of politics and Christianity? And I think about someone like William Lane Craig in this respect. William Lane Craig has great arguments. Well, he has serious arguments, well-formed arguments for God's existence. I think he's an excellent apologist in many respects. And yet he has taken a view with respect to the alignment of Christianity with republicanism and Donald Trump that I think for so many people just not only critically weakens, but perhaps undermines his complete witness. We really need to think through carefully how to relate politics to Christianity. A fourth one, which I just wrote my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, on, is the question of biblical violence. I think for many years, Christians and conservative Protestants particularly have taken defenses of some of these traditional views of biblical violence, such as that God commanded the complete eradication and destruction of peoples like Canaanites, which today would constitute genocidal war crimes. I think that they've done Christianity an enormous disservice by offering their particular defenses and readings of these views. When Christianity is viewed as defending genocide and ethnic cleansing, the mass slaughter of civilian populations when, quote unquote, Deus vult, God wills it, then I think that we do ourselves, again, an enormous disservice for the credibility of Christianity in the modern public square. The fifth one I've dubbed provincial salvation. Many Christians, and this is, I find this to be endemic among these conservative Protestant or evangelical apologists, is that they have this sense of salvation that is narrowly exclusivist. Now, there is a type of exclusivism that I think is essential for Orthodox Christianity, and that is the one that is opposed to pluralism. Pluralism says that there are many ways to be saved, whereas exclusivism on this definition says there is no way to be reconciled to God the Father except through Jesus Christ, John 14:6. There's no other name under heaven by which you are saved. Acts 4:12, I recall that verse is. That is what I call orthodoxy, that Christ is ultimately the one way through which we are saved and reconciled to the Father. However, there's another issue, which is, what does it mean to have been reconciled to God, or to possibly be reconciled to God through Christ? And some people, and this is again rife among conservative Christian Protestant apologists, is they take a very narrow understanding of what that is. So for example, they think, well, you have to have prayed a sinner's prayer. You have to have done Romans 10:9, that declared that Jesus is Lord and that God raised him from the dead. And you have to believe that. And if not, then you're lost forever. Now, technically, if you take that very strong stance, what that entails, among other things, is that infants are all going to hell. If a child dies in infancy, small children all going to hell. So then okay, well, we qualify that a little. Maybe God will allow infants and small children who haven't prayed a sinner's prayer, but everybody else has to. Okay, and then what do you do about the 10-year-old who dies in Auschwitz, Jewish girl, who rejects Christianity, but when she thinks of Christianity, she thinks of the Third Reich? Did she reject Jesus? Is she going to hell? Now, you can go on from there and talk about various other groups as well. My point is this: uh, take at least a more moderate and expansive understanding of what God's salvation is, not toward pluralism, which is a denial of the exclusivity of Christ as the one means through which we are saved, but rather take a step toward a hopeful inclusivism. In other words, reconciling that Christ can save people in far more diverse ways than we may recognize. And simply making other Christians aware of those options, or other people aware of those options, can do enormous value in removing stumbling blocks and obstacles to Christian faith. The last one I want to talk about is hell. This kind of flows on from this provincial idea of salvation. So many Christians are committed still to defending hell simply as eternal conscious torment. Now, there are enormous problems with the concept of hell as eternal conscious torment. Let me just quickly scroll through a few of them. It appears to depend upon a retributive understanding of justice, which is very much not in alignment with the way that most people think about jurisprudence today. So, for example, you killed that person, so we're going to kill you as retribution, or you stole something from that person, so we're going to cut your hand off, the hand that stole that object. For the most part today, we don't think in terms of jurisprudence of a proper form of justice being giving it back to the perpetrator just as they did. So instead, we tend to think of correctional institutes, right? We tend to think of punishment as a mode of societal protection, but also retribution, rehabilitation of the offender. And I do think that is a far preferable and much more humane way of thinking about justice. The classic view of hell as eternal conscious torment is a view which is predicated on ideas of retributive justice, which are widely rejected today. Ideas of such things as torture as being part of legitimate forms of justice. Yes, torture throughout much of Western society was accepted a legitimate form of justice. And the very debate upon whether George Bush's government administration was torturing people by waterboarding them in the mid-2000s is an illustration of how widely we at least accept that torture itself is wrong. And so rather than say, yeah, waterboarding is torture and it's fine, what people instead would say was, well, waterboarding isn't torture, and so it's fine. But if you have a standard of justice in which a person is tortured, well, then that creates a real objection to that standard of justice. And eternal conscious torment proposes that God resurrects people to exist forever for the sake of eternal punishment in body. He resurrects them in body and in soul. And the point then is it's a punishment. It is maximal torture, maximal suffering. That is the ultimate sense of torture and the ultimate offense of our moral sensibilities. Now, some people in the modern era, particularly in the 20th century, they've tweaked the standard view of eternal conscious torment to say, well, maybe it's self-inflicted torture. I don't want to get into the whole conversation here, except to say that that's not, I mean, that's a Band-Aid solution at best. Because if you have somebody who is so disordered that they're inflicting maximal suffering on themselves, the proper response is not to just stand by and watch and say, well, you're choosing to do that, because that is a maximally irrational act. If a person takes a knife in front of you and they start cutting into their own chest and belly, you don't just say, well, you're doing that of your own free will. Why don't you go ahead and do that for eternity? No, you take the knife out of their hands. And if the only way that you can stop them from perpetuating self-harm on them would be to put them into restraints, then you put them into restraints. The idea, no, that God would just allow people to torture themselves forever has enormous problems. Now, one other thing I'll just mention here is that eternal conscious torment also creates this problem when you talk about heaven, because if heaven is supposed to be the place where Revelation 21:4, every tear is wiped away, how do you understand heaven with every tear wiped away, where your loved ones are suffering maximally in hell? If you are resurrected to eternity in heaven, your daughter goes to hell. How can you be enjoying this maximally joyous, blessed existence while your daughter is writhing, being tortured in agony, whether it's self-inflicted or not. Now, the conversation about hell is, of course, not just a philosophical and ethical one, it's a biblical and theological one. And there are arguments all over the map for different views of hell, apart from this, I think, a very grotesque and inhumane understanding of eternal conscious torment. The problem is that not enough Christian apologists are making people aware of that wider conversation. And that brings me to my conclusion that I think there's a lot of good, again, to be said for William Lane Craig's book and for his treatment of apologetics generally. But I wouldn't recommend it for churches because I think for the most part, you spend 4 weeks looking at arguments for God's existence. But the first thing people are going to say to you is, why can't God, or why can't gay people marry? Or why did God command the genocide of the Canaanites? Or how do you reconcile Christianity with evolution? They're not going to ask you about the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument. That's just not where people are at.